I'm the director of the School of Music, Art and Design at the university, and I came into this realm of working in the city and working in public art kind of by default, because we had an agenda as a school wanting to see entrepreneurship in the visual arts and a growth of a creative industry as things that we thought should happen in the metro. And I'll dwell on that as I go along. You don't need to try to read this, it's my prompt for me, but I got it all written up. So this is a presentation I made at the Johannesburg Development Agency conference on public art, on access to public space and public art last year. I've adapted it and tweaked it because I realized there I was talking to people from development agencies and fellow artists, and now I'm talking to the other people, the architects. So there's stuff in here where I'm venturing into your territory. I'll go past it really fast so that I don't make it oops. I call it there using a sustained public art program and creative industries infusion as a means of, I called it hot wiring in that presentation. I'm talking about changing here, but I'll touch on hot wiring. Changing public perception and experience and habits and expectations. And it's evidence of a work in progress. As you all know, Central is a work in progress. Now I'm going to try and make this thing here. So it's adapted from the presentation I made at this public access conference. And the questions I thought I would answer here before anyone catches me and asks them and catches me off guard is, why should artists be messing in the territory of architects and engineers and such like in these reimagining projects, the projects that are to do with the business of regeneration and kind of fixing of decayed areas. And I've got a quote here which I thought kind of justified my being here. This is the professor of public art at Goldsmiths College in London. And he said, good public art creates several positive outcomes, a sense of place, which straight away refers back to the business of your profession, an identity for an area and for a local audience. It also creates thoughts and discussion, both positive and negative, in areas of cities where often things can seem impersonal and distant. So for me, that was the kind of opening to where the visual arts and where architecture perhaps kind of find a space together. And based on a range of kind of fortuitous circumstances, my colleagues and I got involved in inputting into a range of projects, reimagining projects that the Mandela Bay Development Agency has been involved in. So that whole reimagining of these areas in Central, of Route 67 and Belmont Terrace and the stuff that's happened at the Mermaid Precinct, and all of that is MBDA territory, you all know that. When they first rolled out the idea of bringing visual artists into play, the first run-out of artists were the name brand artists. They were the artists who were already well established, largely middle-aged, largely white, largely male. So we thought that that was disadvantageous for our students. It was also disadvantageous for the range of crafters that potentially can feed into a creative industry. So we agitated and we lobbied and we worked with the MBDA and we looked at the range of emerging artists coming into the mix, and that's where we stepped in from the School of Music, Art and Design, mostly working as collectives. So then art educators, gallery owners, metro people all kind of fed into this process. The team that I've worked in largely, we worked in a collective from the university, and the team that I work in now is with David Jones, who's one of my colleagues, who's the head of fine art, and with Marcus Neutzetter, who is from Trinity Sessions in Johannesburg. And we've worked together now on unpacking a couple of projects. So the part of the Nelson Mandela Bay brief that we've responded to has been around, and you'll have seen that in the tender documents that go out from the MBDA, and this is paraphrasing, is harnessing the creative arts and industries activities in service of positive social change as an aspect of urban upgrade, and to use the creative arts as a catalyst for entrepreneurial and economic growth. And we've looked at contributing ideas around how to create a creative place, if that's possible, for residents to live in and for tourists to visit. Initially, the MBDA kicked off with the idea that this had to be a tourist product. And we've argued, and they've argued, as we've gone along, we've seen it's actually got to be a local product that is attractive to tourists, as opposed to a fakely project. So why should artists care about what happens in our inner city? And I've taken quotes, and this is where I mess in your territory. Largely I got these sources, the theoretical sources, from my daughter who studied architecture at UCT. So I'd like purloin all of her books and find these fabulous quotes. This one resonated for me as a guy called Crow, and he said the precise place of a city's origin is often its most poignant reminder of its past, which is one of those meaningless statements, but it's a lovely one. Now, Central for me is special because I grew up in it, and then I moved away, and then I came back as a young student, and I stayed in it, and then I moved away. I taught in it because the art school had its first premises at the Athenaeum back in the day, and that I wasn't around, that was in the 1900s. And then we had rights in perpetuity to teach there. So I taught in these spaces and I've lived in them. So I feel very strongly, and the art school feels strongly, that this is the place of our origin. So as part of what we've done, coming into this as novices, as arty people, and going, oh, I think we'd like this. And architects going, oh my God, beam her up to another planet. We've had to look at the theories. Now, there's a woman who lives across the road from me who's one of my ex-students, and she was an architect's nightmare. She'd go, let's build it. No, don't like it. Let's knock it down. Let's build it. No, bad, my bad. So we got to that place, which there's nobody here I've worked with. They'd be like, take her head off. So we looked at what happens in a city. We wanted to try and understand that. So we wouldn't just put public art in that was lacquer for artists. And we looked at Crow again, saying the death of a settlement occurs when it no longer satisfies the basic needs of the inhabitants. And I know from personal experience that this part of the city has emptied cyclically, and it's an ongoing thing. My parents came as immigrants, and then they moved away. I came back in, and then moved away when I had children, and it was no longer safe for them to grow up here. So the residential part remains the place where many migrants to the city start their lives and they move out from. And that's the case now with a lot of migration down from Africa. So you've got immigrants and migrants and refugees, and always the middle class moving to the periphery. And that's again a quote from two Dutch theorists. Again, what Crow talks about, I love this, the undifferentiated sprawl of suburbs and linear commercial strips. Doesn't that depress you? So this is why for us Central is so important, and why the public art that goes into it is so important. And then this is pure theory again, but it relates to my experience of Central. The cyclical periods of renovation, the post-colonial decay, the sense of transiency, the fact that the public space has become compromised, and it's the public space we've been active in through crime and through people creating gated communities and lockout zones. So the public space becomes a place of transit. And then there are slumlords, and there are few early adopters. We don't have the Cape Town hipsters. Getting our own kind of hipster brigade now that are moving into Central. We don't have our core of Cape Town hipsters who are early adopters. So there's this sense of deterioration and this acceptance that Central is doomed. So the question for us was, what was to be gained by re-energizing? Not just making the place look pretty. And again, Crow saying the experience of a place by any society over a long period of time involves a dialectic between culture and place, aimed at a kind of naturally induced and evolved harmony about human beings building a complex relationship with the place. So we looked at the fact that the art needed to contribute to re-establishing this complex relationship between the people and the place. And that the first thing we felt it had to do was to raise people's expectation of the place. And to challenge that acceptance that decay is inevitable and re-establish the resonance between the old and the new. Now, in some of the projects we've worked on, we've worked with Nicola Dark, and she's focused on heritage. So the aspect of preserving, but not turning into a museum, has been part of what we've talked about with the visual art. And then, obviously from the MBDA's perspective, there's been this business of attracting people into Central and into the inner city. So all of these, the reconnecting of the broader citizenry with the inner city and changing their expectations. So this is where I'll touch briefly on hot wiring. Hot wiring is what, it's what car thieves do, where they want to take your car without having to have the key and know the whole engine. Put the right wires together, get the car to go, and you drive off, and it's gone before people can blink. Hot wiring is also a term used in neurology, where if you're wanting to change the behavior of the brain, you adjust certain synapses, and then the rest of the behavior will change. It's also a term that's used in economics, where you change expectations based on changing a few critical things. So we looked at the visual arts as being one of the critical things. If you were going to create a sense of ownership and pride, if you were to create a lived environment, not just for tourists, you had to actually create something where the visual art provided a huge stimulus. And then we looked at what Heyer and Reindorp warn about, which is the danger of designing for the tourist brochure. The idea that this has to actually be fun for people who live in the space. We did all the landry stuff. You guys will all know the landry, and we took some key elements from it. That if you're aiming for cultural change as opposed to just prettifying, you need to look at the fact that creativity and culture are connected. Business of changing the mindset of the city, which is the hot wiring again, the economic values of creative activities, and the potential for cultural change through creative activities. We also took a brief from the MBDA that this had to be socially inclusive and not elitist. So it wasn't a matter of gentrifying the area, driving out all the immigrant populations, and then creating a kind of white middle-class bastion. So diversity as a driver for creativity, and that became one of the key things in terms of us making creatives. So that we looked at actually empowering a range of students and of crafters. Landy also said, and this is something I've been agitating for at the university, that you need anchor cultural institutions, and I'm going to touch on what we've been trying to achieve in Bird Street. And that cultural investment can only do so much. You need local distinctiveness, so you shouldn't be trying to recreate the kind of Cape Town vibe. You need your own thing. So mimicking other successful projects isn't always the answer. And then this is the stuff that always makes the poor construction people fidgety when we say it, that the hard and soft infrastructural balance, you have to be aware of projects that are simply going to benefit the construction industry and not benefit growing an arts economy. So we worked on that. And the roles that we reckon that creative arts initiatives play in re-energizing Central, if we focus specifically on Central, the business of creating fabulously interesting public spaces and the changing of expectations through the experience of those places with the public art in them. And it assists in that hot wiring process that I've referred to, where you try to change the expectation of what the ordinary man in the street and the civic fathers think about is going to be expected in the inner city. And then obviously the economic scaffolding and the activating of the creative arts economy. So it's not just about putting down a layer of art and then moving on. It's about how that art is going to activate the space. So our agenda as a School of Music, Art and Design was quite specific. promoting arts entrepreneurial activities with the idea that you will then retain creatives in the city. Because a lot of our students leave when they qualify because there isn't an arts economy here. We look at building between ourselves and the metro. We look at building, now that made me nervous, I know those people. Building links between the school and the metro. And then we looked at the bigger thing, which you guys don't have to worry about, but we have to, as educators, the Charter for the Social Sciences and Humanities, and that it sounds like a big government word, but it's a really important document, and it talks about the business of the arts and the humanities as major catalysts for social change, because the country has been focused on science and engineering and technology as the drivers for change. So this is a document that was produced last year by researchers who came, appointed by the Department of Higher Education, mostly came from UCT, and they look at how you are active as creative practitioners in the broader environment. So that for us was a moment of importance. So the inner city, in terms of the creative arts agenda, this is what we came up with, myself and my colleagues. We had to write a report because we were part of Gillian Ardendorf's Bird Street Belmont Terrace Consortium. We had to write a report that looked at what the creative industry should set out to achieve. And these, and you'll see, you'll recognize some of the land use stuff in it. We said there needs to be a local distinctiveness. There needs to be inclusivity in terms of bringing on board ranges of people from different economic and cultural sectors. There needs to be a visual transformation with art infusion and through the installation of public artworks and through arts interventions. There needs to be a strategic rebranding, which is another kind of creative arts activity. It's about designing and rebranding so that you aren't having your light under a bushel. There needs to be the establishment of a sustainable calendar of arts and culture-related activities. And Jacques, who's just come in, is part of what we see as the first rollout with the management of the Athenaeum of a sustainable calendar of activities, because that keeps bringing people in. So the art is actually a catalyst. There need to be ways of managing and growing the precincts, because in some overseas instances where there's been a forced creative precinct made, it fizzles away once there's no more initial drive to actually keep things going. And there need to be mechanisms, and those are mechanisms that we say need to be addressed by the city for expanding the creative arts and creative industry's footprint. And some of those would be with regards to benefits in terms of rates, or benefits in terms of rebates. So we have a bigger picture in mind than just plonking some art into the street. Then in terms of what's happened, that inner city creative agenda, you will all be really aware of that. It's part of the wider remit of the MBDA. There's that huge regeneration spend in terms of infrastructure and safety and cleansing. And then Route 67 took it into a different space, that partnership between the architects, the designers, the urban designers, the crafters, the visual art people. It was intended as a tourism project, but then it moved into skills development and art entrepreneurship, and then it moved into education with us. The Athenaeum building came about at the same time. You know that repurposing of it as an intentionally transformative cultural space for exhibition and performance. And with the Bird Street upgrade, there's been the theatre added. And then the Bird Street Belmont Terrace upgrade, that was the bigger brief that really got us excited. The brief to refocus the area as a cultural precinct with arts and craft and entrepreneurial and educational and retail and heritage. So it's a lived space. So, and there's more to come, and hopefully we'll still retain connections with a range of the projects that the MBDA is rolling out. So before I show you, and I've got pictures, trust me, because I'm a visual artist, so I'm going to show you lots of pictures. But before that, just to celebrate what we sat back the other day and we looked at what's been achieved in terms of creative progress to date. And we put this down as Route 67, the MBDA broke new ground. That installation of major public works as a means of reactivating public space has changed the face of the inner city, and it is setting out to change the expectations of the public around the inner city. You will know people like I know people who go, I haven't been down to the public library in the last 10 years, I wouldn't go down there, it's not safe. That's changing, and it's not just tourists, it's ordinary people that are now moving back into this space. So the spin-offs of that, we've seen the restoration of the Athenaeum and the artworks that are in it and the constant cycle of activities that's there. We've seen the establishment of the upgraded performance space that's intended to attract a broader range of creative participants, and our student artwork and commissioned artworks are in that space. We've seen the growth of a fledgling craft entrepreneurial economy. And that happened, and I'll trace it when I show you the pictures, with the Route 67. There were crafters trained in little mosaic blocks, and then upgrade next time to the larger mosaics, and then upgrade next time to really complex, fine mosaics. So there's a range of people who are now equipped to do something they weren't equipped to do before, and have a kind of aesthetic judgment that is growing. And we've seen a renaissance in the visual arts sector, been for a range of reasons, but not to be underplayed the connection with Central and its regeneration. There's a greater depth of participation in visual arts activities. The Metro is now linked for the third year running to the National Arts Festival. Ismail Mohammed has been incredibly positive about what happens in Central, and he's the creative director at the festival. And so we're now officially linked. It means the Athenaeum is an activity centre. We're putting on an exhibition of Roger Ballin's work in conjunction with the Athenaeum people. They're organising public workshops, so the space becomes lived. And then the working relationship between the MBDA and the NMNU, with the focus on growing that arts economy, is hugely important for us. So Route 67, you know, conceptualised as a tourist product, energized the creative economy, the 67 works symbolizing Nelson Mandela's 67 years of public work, and then the idea that it changes the expectations of place. You know that it was funded by Lotto, because there's normally a kind of unease amongst the public at PE about, all that money on art, and nobody's emptying our bins. So it's not the same money, but you know this. And the first phase was installed on the Donkin, and that was with the workplace. And then the second phase is ongoing. We've worked, some of my colleagues worked with some of the workplace people on the Donkin, and we worked down with Mbona on Strand Street, and we're working with Gillian Ardendorf now in Bird Street. So the second phase of Route 67, that's the map. You all know that they identified the different things. There were some things that were important. There was the idea of a link to the red location, which we created art to refer to, and there's the idea of linking to South End. So you start to link to the periphery and you map across. And then that's the heritage map that was done initially, just as a kind of decorative aspect. And then these are some of the things that were commissioned. This is Shepherd Zago's map that Marcus Notesetter drove. It's a lino-cut map. It's incredibly difficult to find your way if you use that map, but it's really pretty. And then it's linked to a much more kind of explicit map. So the idea of bringing lino-cut, which is a strength of a large number of crafters in this area and artists who have no formal training, bringing that in as a creative aspect. The Wayfarer markers, also designed and then crafted locally. Jacques had a lot to do with supporting the design of that, because he assists Marcus Noitesetter. And we're hoping that there's a kind of whimsy in all of this, because the idea that the Wayfarer markers, you can't see them really clearly now, but you'll have seen some of them up, look like glowing newspapers. And that's PE, and everybody goes, oh my God, the windy season goes to the coast. So you use what you have. And then these are the posters. This is the information that goes up on the wayfaring markers. There's one of them installed that is down at the Campanile. And then the Campanile project I was quite extensively involved in and my students worked on. And this is a reverse image, and I'm crediting in Bournemouth so that nobody gets across because their design is out there without their signature on it. We looked at the idea that, and this is where we worked through concepts with the students, the Campanile as a celebration of settler, a settler contribution, and this big kind of campanile structure that is rectangular and solid. And we looked at the business of the curve as something that is indigenous and local, like the kraal that is embracing. And we looked at how you could create a gathering place here where people would meet if they were going to walk up the Route 67, and we looked at this as being a berm that was curved and would speak to creativity, indigenous creativity, not linked to colour, but linked to being home-born. Born in South Africa, and born in the Metro, and born in the Eastern Cape. And one of my students got the commission, and I worked with him on that, for a narrative that works counterclockwise. You go in and you start at the past and you come back to the finish. We're going to recast it, so this is where artists go wrong, because the colour has shifted from the different, on the different panels. So they're going to recast it all at once. We cast as the person was working, and that meant that the colour shifted with the colour mixes. But it is a fabulous narrative because it celebrates Fred Page and Pemba, and Danny Williams, who was the guitarist who went overseas, and a range of people who maybe aren't all known and who should be known. And then below it is going to be, we've got African red granite, and Evans, we had a poem competition, and somebody spoke about the business of being young in the Metro now. And so her poem won, and it's going to be engraved onto that tablet. So you'll come in, you'll read the poem, and then you'll come out and you'll read the narrative. This was we put in place a series of glass sculptures, and then Art found out that, yes, there's definitely a lot of humidity around the coast. So those are being relocated to live in the tramways building so that they don't have the problems of humidity attached to the curves, and then below that is going to go the poem engraved. And this is him working in the studio. That was a fabulous affirmative moment for that student who would have left, because he came originally from the Transkei. He would have left the Metro. He's now playing a role in a number of community art projects, and he stayed. So score one for us in that. And he's busy installing the work. There's the example. The second one that I was involved in was down in that Strand Street area, the Strand Street Pillars project, and it was a competition, people entered, and again one of our students, Lubin Mutati, won it. He's now moved to Cape Town. But he had already done a project about being young and having an identity where he had to grapple with the idea of Labolo and Christianity and tradition, and where did he fit in the middle of this? So he put forward a proposal to expand that, and it's deliberately done in that area because it enlivens that area. So here is a lit out, fabulous version of what you see at night in a place we don't normally put public artworks. And that was cheaply done, because that was done with vinyl, heat mounted onto the pillars in the same way as they mounted the World Cup pillars down on the pillars. It's got a couple of years lifespan. We're hoping for longer. And this is what you see. And weirdly, even the fruit sellers are more organized now because they're in a space which is slightly more decorated. They actually arrange everything. So I just think we had a total effect. These are the kind of things, the questions you raise. The white students are not our past who posed for that. The business of being white and living in South Africa now. This money isn't everything, but everything makes me want it. The whole business of consumerism and the stuff we talk to students about, and they haven't got answers. The business of being African or being cultured and where that fits. Those aren't resolved, they're interesting questions. So we hope that that's like a provocative space. And then in Jetty Street, we were involved in a range of projects, one of which was an interesting one called the Walk of Words. We'd done value words at the institution when we were doing Vision 2020, and what people actually believed was in a word that would make you want to be in a place. So we had a phone-in around all the community radio stations, and we got people to phone in with values, things that they would like to build their lives on. And then the ceramic students made them in terms of embossed work. Now, some of them were cracked, so if you go down there, they've got to be replaced. But mostly, they worked fabulously. That was on the ground, and then those are the posters. The MBDA paid for a series of works to be bought from competition with David Goldblatt and Helen Sabidi as the judges. I was a judge with them along with Michael Barry. And we selected our works by emerging artists, some older, more established artists, and these are the posters that actually called people to go to the red location. And then these are the works that are going to go to the tramway. We had 3 female students looking at the role of women in the metro. So hers was about the business of the mapping. This one here is about the business of the map. And they're layered glass sculptures that go into stained glass boxes. And they're going to be lit properly in the tramways and hopefully no humidity. They're about so big. And they talk to the contribution of women. Women settlers, women from the indigenous tribes in the area, people who've come in and who've made a contribution. And then these are our hipster boys, these are our gangster boys, and they have got a project, they run as a collective called the Four Blind Mice. And they came originally from the northern suburbs, and they love graffiti, and they are making a living from it. They just had an exhibition at the Belling, and they have had exhibitions in Johannesburg now. So again, this has acted as a catalyst. And they did the mural in the bus shelter. Here we go. There we go. The top one was the layout, and then they actually did the implementation. Now the bus shelter is quite sort of myth. It smells of wee and bleh. But it is a much more jolly space with that colour in it. And then the Vusili Mini is work that's now in storage, waiting for Vusili Mini to be tiddled up and made fabulous. That was conceptualized as conversations with the Queen. Now I'm going to speed up because these are the ones I want to just really dwell on. But all of these projects meant that we brought students in who had no knowledge of the history of the area, who very often lived in Summerstrand in decks, or who came from the northern areas or from the townships and came right through the city centre as a place of transit. And they suddenly got to know about the space. A lot of them have moved here now, and they got to see it as potentially a place that they could live in. So this is Conversations with the Queen, which is a real post-colonial exercise, because people were talking about taking Queen Vic off the square, and we looked at the argument of putting people in conversation with her. And so we took the people down. There's Queen Victoria. These are the students making them. They worked with body casts, and then they had tremendous fun. And then sculpted forms for the heads. There's Durrell Sapiri sitting next to every man. We took them down on a trial. They went on outings. So the sculptures would go down to Market Square on an outing, like they were going out for the day. And then people would come and comment and talk and have their kind of comment. There's a dog that in the end looked like a jackal, so now it's a jackal that was peeing on Queen Victoria's foot. There are a range, this is every man. And interestingly, we've had situations with nursing students who came to look at this exhibition, and we got involved in a whole political discussion with people of very widely differing political backgrounds. And because these sculptures are out there, they act as a catalyst for discussion. We took them to a law conference, and the lawyers stood around because they represent the Constitution in some way, the people who are involved. So there's Durrell next to every man. There is on the right is it's not Helen Sabini, she's a unionist. name has escaped me. She's a unionist handing out her flyers. On the left is the archetypal nanny, who's taken care of, on her back is a white baby. We had interesting discussions about the fact that that changes. You have a white child on the back of a black mama, and when that child grows older, there's a separation, and that has been historical. The situation may be changing, but a lot of people have talked through that. That's the young, that's Biko, next to Garvin and Becky, if I'm correct. No, that's Garvin and Becky. They're posed with Nelson Mandela as a young person. And this is the response you get. It was a fabulous response. You get little kids, you get really nice kind of intimate moments where people come out and just hang out and converse. Then Michael Barry did a series of works up St. Mary's Steps. This is when the works were not completed. There's a whole lot more of them that talk to the youth uprisings and the people who died in the Metro and in the Eastern Cape during the youth uprisings of the 70s. The Whites Road and Donkin Hill projects, I'm going to briefly run through. That's Marcus Neutzetter from the Trinity projects. And they did the project on the cliff in Whites Road. They did the contour path. There's an enormous amount of engineering and architecture and art engagement that had to take place. They did the voting tower. So that's the taxi installation in Whites Road, lit out at night whilst they were testing the lights. That's the actual construction. It looks really good in terms of building, in terms of the contour path as it was being constructed. That's the voting tower as it was being installed. And all of this brought people in, because you will know that they brought thousands of children in to make their marks on the stairs. And those became the vote of those kids, who will now come back and bring their own children and look to see where their mark is on the stairs. You'll also know that this is the place of the downhill dash, which is Jacques' territory, where there is the most awesome skateboarding race takes place down that once a year. And then this is lit out. Again, we had students involved in this, and they went around and they drew people in the inner city, and then they used them as the basis for this kind of celebratory, bright lit wall. These are the little mosaics. These are the more complex mosaics. I'm going to show you the most complex mosaics in a minute. This is the tourism stuff that happens there now, which didn't happen before. With people, that's Anton Momberg's sculpture, which is like a photo opportunity moment. That's Donna Sepeto's, an ex-student's big fish bird. And then these are the students and crafters and untrained crafters that came on board to do the Piazza mosaic on the Donkin. They worked in the Grand Gardens, and then they carry stuff across and install it. And it was a massive project. These are economy-based projects. There they are working, and there's the actual design at the bottom, and the students doing the crafters doing the installation. And that's the final product. We're really pleased that it got onto the cover of one of the major art magazines, not because of the project itself, but because somebody had taken such a fabulous photograph of it that they'd entered it as a photograph of a monument. And then this is Anthony Harris's voting line. And those are the tourists. If you go across to the Donkin, there was nobody there except crack dealers before. And now you've got people picnicking and little kids and families from Central, and you've got bunches of tourists. That's about as good as it gets. Somebody posing with Nelson Mandela. So then briefly, the Bird Street Belmont Terrace upgrade, which is a work in progress. That was where the MBDA took it one step further and said, now you've got to look at public access to and engagement with the creative arts as a core driver of the whole precinct, and that informing infrastructural changes. So we had some battles when the architects had to realize that the art people were going. So, but we got there, and I think it's worked fabulously. So I learned so much in this project. There was a really intense social facilitation run by Anna Siernickel. And it brought in communities. They worked with Photo Voice, with children from the area. There were a whole bunch of stakeholder consultations. Then there was a very integrated design process. And the art and the infrastructural projects had to be like so. And then the Athenaeum and the activities and branding and the marketing we've argued for that, and it's actually happened. So that's that project. This is Borich and Gillian Ardendorf, just showing the placing of the Bird Street precinct as being really pivotal in terms of linking the Garvin and Becky strip up to the art gallery. And then the creative goals that we brought in from the research with the business of building a profile of creative arts, and the visual change in the precinct that had to actually precede a change in hot wiring, an visually enriched neighborhood for residents, safety, which is not the art thing, but it is an aspect. And everyone clamored for safety across the board, and then creative skills transfers, and art that speaks of the now, as opposed to being historical, kind of museum-y. And art that celebrates the cultural history of the place, the sustainable program of activities, creative arts anchor tenants, the youth culture, because we're looking at the fact that it's the younger generation that actually has to drive us into the future, and then a day-night culture, which is something that was identified in overseas creative precincts. If you couldn't get that right, and everyone left at 5 o'clock, your project was a fail. It had to be sustainable without it being hookers at night. It had to actually have a lived space. So the questions that we kept asking ourselves regarding the role of the creative arts in making a city habitable, in placemaking and in cultural regeneration, we had to put out to the broader public. So that public participation process looked at all of those different kinds of creative, entrepreneurial and business activities and got feedback from them. Now that's that area. These are owned by private people. So obviously the hope is that by putting the art in place, changing the infrastructure, you're going to get people who actually use these properties better and who regenerate them and who make something of them in terms of investment properties. That's a photo voice project that the kids from Greenwood did, where they highlighted the things that worried them and the things that they liked in the area. And it was really interesting that, for instance, they talked about rerouting themselves to walk past Artec because of the mural. They'd go a different way home from school because it made them feel good. And they would talk about the fact that the Athenaeum was a place that they felt was safe to go into if they felt scared. But there were also other places that are closed to the road because people, because of their safety, keep the place closed. And those keep out the safety aspect for pedestrians. They highlighted the areas where the prostitutes were and the drug dealers were and whatever. So in the end, this is what we came up with in terms of the visual arts. This isn't just the infrastructural stuff. And the first was the Athenaeum driving the performance aspect. It had already been upgraded by the MBDA in terms of exhibition. We argued for the theatre to be upgraded, and that's been done. Now the whole thing starts to pull together. We argued for Trimber Square as a village green space with artworks that talk to children and families and have activity-related usages. We argued for the gallery belt up at the top to be given a look. That will happen hopefully in another phase of that project, so that the street speaks to the business of that being a gallery belt. And we argued from our side, after 2 years of argument and business plans, that the university retain its Bird Street premises when the business school moves, and that they look at allowing us to use those for creative purposes, for an institutional gallery, like all other universities have, for postgraduate space, for pre-tertiary. Any of you who grew up in PE will remember that the music department used to have a pre-tertiary space in Bird Street where kids could come to learn music. And now that they're in Summerstrand, there are 30 kids. There were 300 kids in Bird Street. So we're looking to have those things re-established. So there's the Athenaeum in its upgraded state. This is the kind of stuff by now that the mosaicing community can do. And that is really intricate stuff, that mosaic. It's way different. That's a commissioned work inside. That's the view inside. You all know that space. There's the detail of this very beautiful thing which reflects up onto the cylinder and then creates its kind of normal form on that. That's the planning for the Athenaeum. We've got a curved berm, kind of snake-like curved berm, so that there's some kind of earth art happening. It's been grassed. This is when they were busy doing the actual laying of the soil. The theatre's now in operation. I took these pics whilst it was still in its planning stage. So that's Gillian's upgrade. We've got a student that, the person who did the mural at Arctic, they're making lines and curtains using his, so it's pop art with a local feel, because they used for that Arctic mural the local people who live in the Central. They bought paintings to go up. That's a Derek Erasmus, this is a Robert Brooks. Those are artists who work in Central, who live in Central. And then these are, it's saying something funny on the report, it says resume slideshow. We have resumed. These are our students' first year projects. They were bought to put into boxes in the foyer. And they're all fantasy masks. And so it means right from our first year. And there are entrepreneurial things that are obviously not just linked to the benefits of the art school. This isn't a kind of capitalist grab. But right from the first year, people are able to sell work into this process. That's the very bright, funky theatre, which you all know. And then this is where it goes next. And there's the place where if you drive past on a Saturday evening, you can see the crack pipes, smoke going, all gone now, all closed off. And what we're looking at now, I shouldn't reveal all of Gillian's secrets to you, but we're looking at benches that are going to be made by crafters that are going to surround that centre part where the people play sport. So that's going to remain as an activity zone, that are going to be Gaudi-esque, but not Gaudi. They're going to be based on those curved root systems, so they'll be made by crafters, and there will be mosaic. So again, we're building on the mosaic economy. This is the stuff, just briefly, that we see from that spin-off to do with the arts energy in the arts collectives. The links to an art walk and the links to the festival. That's the stuff we used for, which was again was designed by somebody that Jacques works with, as the relaunch of Bird Street, the Bird Street Bash. And I loved the fact that the next day all the prostitutes were wearing Bird Street Bash t-shirts. So it was inclusive. This was not gentrification. And I mean, people thought I was nuts. I thought that was the most fabulous thing. And they had Winston and Shauna come to talk about culture. It was on Heritage Day last year that relaunched. And then this is the area that the university, this is the jewel in the university's crown. And those are the most fabulous, that's the Fleming building, which has got a really fabulous spiral staircase in it. If you haven't seen it, it is worth going to. All architects should see that staircase. And we looked at putting forward a series of plans about an auditorium, art galleries, and space. And then there's the Arctic mural that is a really fitting end to this. The questions that we've got to keep asking ourselves are, will an infusion of creative arts activities act as a long-term catalyst for this? And I don't think there's an answer to that, because some places fail once they become organized and some places flourish. And then the questions which you obviously ask yourselves about, what is it that makes a creative place, that takes it away from just being infrastructure and makes it a place where people feel alive, and what needs to be in it, and is there a recipe? And then if you construct a hybrid creative space and a creative culture, can it be socially engineered? So those are the bigger questions which I don't have an answer for, but I had to put this up because that is Paulo Freire, who's a radical educationalist, and who argues that you need to take critical action in order to create critical change. It's not just a matter of sort of powdering the nose of the pig. You're putting lipstick on a pig or whatever. You actually have to do something that is a bit out there. So we won't know until we keep trying. So you're not going to get rid of the creative arts people in your projects from now on. We're going to be slipstreaming right behind you in the centre of town. But thank you for listening to me.
white flight or middle class suburbanization.
Cheap land.
Cheap land. Thanks, John. Architect of the university.
Moral degradation.
All of our creative minds, the young ones especially, and zoom them out to Summerstrand, and they're still out there. And I think the elephant in the room that no one can speak about, including you, is that that doesn't belong out there. It belongs here. And
we've had that discussion, and it's been, our new Vice Chancellor is aware of this, because obviously there's been a whole change in the dispensation. I've put it to our top people, and they were like, shut up. That actually, everyone bleats about Central. When I lived in Cora Terrace, I lived next to Adam Mohammed, and everyone moaned about him, but he got his land from Nick Wolf, he got his buildings from Nick Wolf, and after that, he sold to whoever. So there it went. But who was the first catalyst in that bought up the land in Central, bought up the properties? My mother bought a house in Cora Terrace for 19,000 rand on Vine and Howard's auction when the university decamped. And they bailed, and they left, that was open season for people to come in, because the university had all residential properties, it had flats, it owned property, and it bailed. So it created something, and I feel morally it now needs to answer to that. So it's not, everyone's not going to move back, but the argument that we've put is that the stuff like they have, like the Herald, those difficult dialogues, that now happens at New Brighton, it happens at the Feather Market, and that needs to happen on Bird Street. The public needs to come in. They ran a talk the other day on climate change at Bird Street. So you bring people back into that space, the creative aspect where we can put postgraduate students. We don't have space for postgrad students. We can build that as a postgraduate space. All that we can do is try to seize territory on behalf of the creatives. But the other aspect, which is positive for Central, so that would deal with the university's property. And I agree that the university was short-sighted in abandoning so much of the Central campus. It's not on their structure plan in terms of Department of Higher Education funding, because it's considered to be an entrepreneurial property, which means that it doesn't get infrastructural funding as it stands. And they're looking at changing that, but that's work in progress for them. The other aspect to do with the university was that the people who lived in Central, the students who lived in Central, all moved out to live in Summerstrand. Not in Res, because there isn't enough Res, but if you've flown over PE and you've looked, Summerstrand doesn't have any gardens, because everybody, including our upper hierarchy, has got 94 students packed in the back like squatters. And they're earning big money that is going into the pocket, no doubt. Don't go there. But now the people in Summerstrand, if anyone lives in Summerstrand, they will know that there's a huge hoo-ha, because there's crime in Summerstrand, and the students are bored out of their trees in Summerstrand. So there's been a whole move. The international office has been working with people in Havelock Square to bring students back in here. Nico Juster, who's a historian from the international office, is dead keen to see residential components. That's all that can be done.
I don't have a dialogue on this thing, but I'm talking very specifically, maybe I didn't articulate myself nicely. I'm talking about, if we're talking about very specific creative, I'm not talking about all the 20,000 students in the I'm talking about the creative industry, the art school. I haven't heard a voice, and maybe that's because I'm not listening properly. I haven't heard a voice saying that we have to move our schools of fine art.
They won't. They won't. They've refused. We've spoken.
Tim, because after Mary, I was going to say.
I haven't heard the voice. I know there are people that think they are powerful, but that shouldn't stop people articulating, because to be motivating for a creative arts industry to happen here without that headquarters, it's almost the same as motivating for a proper fan culture for soccer. But no, we can't have a sports, we can't have a soccer team here, we'll have that in Germany, but we must have a fan culture. It's so integral, the idea of a creative arts school and the idea of a creative arts industry is so integral that we should rather either make a big noise or make it happen.
Well, then I'm thinking slipstream on you, because we've done this, they've done it. John Rush had clip and clop for years about the Bird Street stuff. We clipped and clopped about the Feather Market, about the post office building. We hoorah'd and nagged from, going back, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, it's like 20 years of whining, and it's gotten nowhere. So we've made a big inroad, but what they say is, yeah, but the creative people need to be on campus, because if they aren't, and Andrew will vouch for this, our students and their students work 24/7. Nobody else does. There's no campus life there. My son's a science student. They get in their car and they go home as soon as they're finished. There's no life. So they talk about the living and learning community. They would rather eat their noses off their faces than let us move the whole creative community. But that said, we've spoken about it enough. We've whined. If we can have voices that come from here, whoo-hoo, we'll go with it. We'll slipstream you.
I just haven't seen the noise. I haven't seen the toy. I haven't seen people chain themselves to buildings. I haven't seen people take this.
No, but you're saying it's got to be us. We're saying it's got to be you.
Yeah, I see it.
It's got to be the people that have vested interest.
It's but those people that have been individuals and groups and large and have made a noise at the right place, but they become just the face of noise, and they get written off by it's just noise.
There's IT people making a hoo-ha.
Yeah, and city strategic objectives for the city, okay, as their priorities, and strategic objectives for the university, and their priorities. The city will tell you that 85% of its population aren't even housed. So the whole heritage and central thing it's way off the agenda. Okay? That's where the city's going. We've got to house people first. The varsity is saying, these are the properties we have from a property perspective, and from a concentration of activity and all the strategic objectives for the varsity. In fact, 2 years ago, my understanding of it, and I'm not at the high level meetings, but it was settle central, get a bit going in Mission Vale, there's a bit of a political agenda, you can't close that down, even though it would possibly be expedient to sort that out and concentrate activities on whatever reasons in the past it ended up there, that's what it is.
For 16 million rand, so it's 90 million in terms of quantity surveying costs to rebuild bricks and mortar, not finish.
Yeah.
In terms of that. And then what happened with us, and it was serendipitous. Vice Chancellor's been making a noise every year with the Vice Chancellor's evening, bless his soul, I love him dearly, don't think I'm being rude about him, saying, we're going to get you an art gallery. And when we were at the Athenaeum one evening, we spoke to him, we went, it's the road, we can have that. And they said, well, talk to us, put in the motivation. They thought, so we went hardcore and we got a proper business plan and we drove it with the people from innovation and with the Vice Chancellor Research Office. And we drove it soundly. And at the same time, I think they got word, and this is what I understand, but I haven't seen in writing, that the Department of Higher Education frowns upon universities selling properties that actually it owns. Because then they straight away want more buildings when they've sold those. And it's happened all over the place. People have sold buildings in other provinces to fund debt at universities. So that's why we got our foot in. You are totally right.
But the long and the short of it is that there are these different stakeholders that in making a better city or better city precincts, and in an understanding of all that are the opportunities to be availed of. And if there was working together to align those in this ideal state, that's achievable. At the end of the day, expediency, lower order priorities on the hierarchy of needs, basic needs as opposed to what are seen as drive the different groups to different strategic ends, and they operate along those lines. It sounds like a very principled argument, but that's the long and the short of it.
Well, that's the realistic thing. The other realistic thing, Andrew, is that if you move people lock, stock and barrel, In terms of square meterage, if you take what architecture would argue for in terms of the square meterage it needs to meet the professional requirements when they get inspected, to get that kind of space here, short of raising whole blocks and building up, you end up, I mean, the house I lived in Kora Terrace was the maths department. And it had these conduits on the floor and we tripped over everything. And they'd done a board market plan to make a residential house into something that was, and there were lots of those little ones. So if they're wanting a grand kind of state-of-the-art space, it's not going to be easily done here. And that's again the argument that the university would use in terms of how would you create a space. So what we looked at absolutely kind of cold realism. What could we do that would involve the least amount of spend to get into Byrne Street?
Sounds very polite.
No, Tim, you must understand that these, okay, short of, and again, as with heritage, it tends to be a small community that are up for making a noise in the first place and getting mobilized. We don't have this the informed millions that are aware of the issues and ready to wrap themselves en masse around buildings, etc., etc.
But what they could do, Andrew, we can piggyback on these dear souls, because if they give us their support for the idea of Byrne Street, it's a voice from the creative community saying, this is, but we still run the risk with all of our business plans that somebody who's higher up the scientific pecking order, and is up the kind of evolutionary tree, is higher and has like a better vantage point than us, will snaffle those Byrne Street buildings. So we've put in really strong argument.
And it sounds like there's a can't do attitude coming from this. And it's not that at all. I think everyone's realized and over years fought for the ideal community in Central for architecture. It's a far more, although I think we've got one of the greatest precedents of late modernist architecture in the country, and the song hasn't been sung. Nevertheless, it's a richer, and the lessons we learn from that there for the architecture part, but nevertheless, it's a richer milieu that something like an architecture department in Central can, students can get a lot more from the richness of that milieu. And the value of it is there. It has been put forward to the decision makers reasonably strongly at times, very strongly at other times, and you can manage, if you want to be making that decision, you can manage that in certain ways. So all I can say to Mary is, or for appeal as Mary's is, yes, more could be said. I don't think it must be the same noises from the same people, just get those people written off as crazies generally, or just you can decide that he's always going to make a noise, just don't worry about it anymore. How much of a noise will need to be made is quite a bit if it's going to get the decision makers on their strategic objectives, as I understand them, to make these about turns. We have to be quite radical, but please, get the petitions going.
Support that the art school should have a presence in Central. That's the toehold. We will invade, we will grow like a fungus.
Can I say something?
Yes, thanks.
Obviously, I'm new here, so, and this, what we're discussing is very complex, and I don't know exactly the history and things like that. I just heard you saying to Tim that we're waiting for you, and he's saying, well, we're waiting for you. But I think if you are single voices, you always be single voices in some way. If you can sing together as a choir in some way, I don't know how you organize a choir, then you are much stronger as an entity to address these issues. Otherwise, it would just be the art group is saying this, the architects are saying this, and there's some social groups that are saying. But how do you put them together? That's a complex issue, because you obviously get involved with political positions, other things, different opinions. But if somehow, I don't know, maybe I'm talking of not understanding something.
In an ideal world, and I think that for me, and I've worked at the art school for 30 odd years, and for 30 odd years, 25 odd years, there's been talk about being central. John Rushmore, the whole time he was at architecture, used to lobby it. And what we've got now is, to use military parlance, we've kind of we've opened a corridor which was not there before. And it came pretty close, and if you look at what came out of the public facilitation in Bird Street was this terrible fear by people with money that if the university sold those properties, it would take 5 or 6 years for the dust to settle to see who was going to be in them, because there's no control over how things are going to evolve once a critical landowner like the university moves. So that would put a damper on any kind of investment in the area, because people would be waiting to see whether it was going to turn turtle or not. So it's a big step that we've made, and I think that I would be really pleased to be able to go back and say, I was able to give a presentation, and I mentioned that we are lobbying, being very careful in front of the university architect. I mentioned that we were lobbying, and that we put forward plans, and that everyone was overjoyed at the thought, can I have this as a vote, that the thought that there might again be a creative arts presence from the university in Central.
If, I think that statement would be easily supported. Or what I'm a little bit vague in my mind, Mary, is that if there is this campaign, and it really exists, and you're calling on this group and others who aren't here today to support that campaign, how do we find that campaign, and who's the champion of that campaign, and how do we email them and say, great, we're all behind you? Where is that? And is there a champion?
I'm the champion.
Ah, okay.
What's happened is that we put forward a concept, and then we went with Jarrell, and because obviously the MBDA has a vested interest in terms of not seeing the university to camp from Bird Street. We went with Jarrell and we had a conversation. We presented to our MANCO, to our top MANCO, then we presented to eMANCO, to the extended MANCO. Then we went through finance and we went through a whole business plan, and then it served at MANCO again. They're now waiting for clarification from the Department of Higher Education about what the funding would be for that campus in terms of infrastructure. But they also, I think, know that they can't sell it. But that said, that might mean that somebody else would come in, like health sciences or whatever, and make it into a nursing college. And you don't know, because the ground has moved from under our feet before. So I'm happy to find out from the people I've been working with in terms of planning, whether I can give you a letter that says, this is what we're hoping to achieve. What does the architectural profession think about this? And if we get a letter back saying, yes, go for it, we use it as a tool to support, to reinforce the logic. I think it hangs on what we would put there. At the moment, what we've put forward, and I probably shouldn't be raising any of this, I'm going to get into trouble in my next life. What we've put forward is postgraduate space using prefabs, a university art gallery, and then pre-tertiary space for music, and the Felsted building, we're arguing, should be returned to being residential, like it was in the university times, and like it was in the, when the Navy was in there, because the Navy had a billet there. So it's geared for residential. Nicola actually did a plan for us, just counting how many rooms you would get in terms of residential if you put bathrooms and things in, just so that we'd have an argument. And then they talked at infrastructure about that being potentially a private-public partnership, where they would look at a developer. So those are things, if somebody's going, whoa, good idea actually, and that the international office would then populate with international and postgrad students. So those are the kinds of things we've been talking about. They're quite specific, and we've looked at costings and how to break even and whatever. So there's been a lot of homework done. Now we're in this pause waiting for the Department of Higher Education. I'd be really happy to be able to say, I've engaged with you guys, making a presentation about art, and this discussion came up, and you're really interested, and can I please send you more information as the the architects would